3 children ate a dog in the ruins northwest of Mulberdale. Not a stray, not vermin caught for sport. Someone's companion, killed and cooked because meat was meat, and the alternative was another night of bark soup and grass. When the Witcher found them, they accepted his coin with a blank pragmatism of those who no longer remembered satiation. Then they vanished, as children did in Velen, swallowed by the same hunger that had already taken everything else. This was not the war. The war had moved on. Columns of Nilfgaardian soldiers marching north toward Novigrad, leaving Velen behind like a carcass picked clean. What remained was quieter, more patient. The fields still existed, the soil had not been salted, rain still fell and seasons still turned. Everything necessary for abundance waited in the earth, ready to give. But the farmers were dead. The seed had been eaten. The oxen had been slaughtered for meat that fed armies who never returned. And in the spaces where human order once held, older things stirred, things that had always been there, waiting in the bogs, listening through severed ears nailed to trees. The peasants of Crookback Bog had a name for them, the good ladies. The swamps held their breath, not silence. Velen knew nothing of silence. The bogs whispered with the settling of corpses into peat, with the slow drip of rain through canopy gaps, with the endless susurrus of flies over standing water. But there existed a quality beneath the sound, a held note, an absence where something vital should have hummed. The hunger had no name because names implied suddenness, edges, a moment when plenty became want. This was older. The earth itself remembered leaner days, epochs when the roots clutched at stones and found nothing, when the wild things ate bark and the bark eaters vanished into the fossil record. What walked through Velen in the years after the first Nilfgaardian columns trampled north was not famine in the sense of a passing crisis. It was return. The province lay in western Temeria, sprawling from forest margins to bog-drowned lowlands, where the land softened into marsh before the rivers met the sea. Once it claimed a capital, Velen, where merchants tallied grain shipments and mages studied at the famous academy on Fyke Isle nearby. The province stretched across a patchwork of field and fen, where the soil gave grudgingly and the harvest never quite filled the barn. Poor before the war, desolate after. The game chronicles rendered the devastation in every frame. Villages reduced to char marks and foundation stones, gibbets lining the roads, bodies left to ravens because the living lacked strength to bury them. The Northern War had washed over Velen like a flood, and when the waters receded, they left a different landscape. The soldiers moved on. The hunger remained. The people called it no man's land. Though men still lived there, they simply stopped mattering in the arithmetic of kingdoms. Before the equations of scarcity, the baseline, Velen subsisted, that word chosen deliberately, on agriculture, animal husbandry, modest crafting. The province possessed no mineral wealth, no trade monopoly, no strategic harbor. What it offered was arable land, though even that proved marginal. The soil demanded constant labor for uncertain return. Swamps claimed the low ground. Forests, thick with the oak and ash, covered what the bogs didn't swallow. Between these zones, farmers scratched out fields. The province served as waypoint on trade routes running south from Novigrad through Sintra to more prosperous realms. But waypoints collect dust, not wealth. Merchants passed through. Revenue passed by. This was the condition before anything burned. The wars, first the brief skirmish between Temeria and Redania, then the great Nilfgaardian invasion, introduced new variables. An army, the saying went, marched on its stomach. What it left in its wake were stomachs that no longer marched. When foraging parties swept through a region, they took everything portable: grain stores, livestock, preserved foods, seed corn, breeding stock. They took the present and the future in a single afternoon. The game chronicles preserve this in granular detail. Near the abandoned site of Martin Foley's plantation, once the largest producer of alfalfa in the region, a ruined estate testified to rapid collapse. The Lord fled to Kovir when the fighting began, leaving management to an incompetent steward. The fields went fallow. The granaries emptied. The land itself, absent its aristocratic absentee, simply ceased to produce. This pattern repeated throughout Velen. The Battle of Velen, waged somewhere in the province's heart, left corpses enough that scavengers swarmed the bridges afterward, hence Marauder's Bridge in the common naming. The dead fed crows. The survivors fed on scraps the marauders missed. Then came disease. Epidemic followed army, as shadow follows body. The Nilfgaardian occupation brought plague. Type unspecified in the sources, though symptoms suggested cholera or typhus, waterborne afflictions that thrived in the aftermath of war, when wells ran foul and bodies lay unburied. Linenvale, one of Velen's many impoverished villages, saw its poverty deepened by war levies, and the epidemic that spread after the Nilfgaardians' arrival deepened poverty, a clinical phrase for children dying in shit-stained blankets while their parents burned with fever they could not name. The economic model cracked along predictable fractures. War destroyed productive capacity. Occupation extracted surplus. Disease killed laborers. Each loss compounded. Fewer hands meant smaller harvests meant less food, meant weaker bodies meant more disease meant fewer hands. The spiral, once begun, fed itself. Mid-Copse, a typical farming settlement, one of the larger villages, spared direct fighting, nevertheless found itself in famine's grip, not because soldiers torched its fields, but because the soldiers torched fields elsewhere, and trade routes collapsed, and merchants stopped coming, and the price of salt climbed beyond reach, and preserved foods became memory. The village stood intact. Its people starved anyway. This was the cruel mathematics. You could survive the war and still die of it. The province's economic base, never robust, simply evaporated. Fields required seed, plow animals, able bodies, reasonable expectation of harvest. When soldiers took the grain stores, they took next year's seed. When they slaughtered cattle, they eliminated plow teams. When plague killed farmers, it removed expertise. Which field drained well, where to plant peas versus rye, when frost threatened. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, died with its carriers. What remained was land that demanded work and population too depleted to provide it. The game rendered this through absence, where NPCs should mill about markets, empty spaces, where livestock should graze, bare pasture, where smoke should rise from chimneys, cold stone. The developers understood that Famine's signature was not dramatic wreckage, but quiet abandonment, the slow fade of human presence from a landscape that continued, indifferent, without it. Merchants, where they appeared, charged prices untethered from value. A loaf of bread that should cost coppers demanded crowns. This was not gouging in the moral sense, though morality certainly figured, but recognition of scarcity's iron law. When supply contracts and demand remains, price rises until equilibrium is reached, which in famine conditions means equilibrium with death. The poor die first because they cannot pay. Then the slightly less poor. The curve climbs the economic ladder until intervention or collapse. Velen experienced both. In times of plenty, gods accept gratitude. In times of want, they receive bargains. The shrines dotted Velen's roads like mile markers. Though they measured distances other than space, rough carved wood formed images. A woman in three aspects, mother and maiden and crone. Faces rendered with the folk skill that prioritized recognition over artistry. These were not icons for contemplation, but working altars, places where transaction occurred. Melitele, goddess of harvest, hearth, and fertility. Her worship predated kingdoms, older than the conjunction, rooted in agricultural necessity. Farmers prayed to her because farmers required favorable conditions, timely rain, mild frost, soil that bore. She represented the hope that cosmic forces might be negotiated with, that ritual could influence outcome. The offerings clustered at her feet told their own chronicle. In lean times, bread crusts, small beer, wildflowers. In desperate times, blood. The quest, defender of the faith, chronicled the backlash. A weeping woman reported that someone had toppled the Melitele shrines along the roads, desecrated the sacred places. She begged aid to restore them. Investigation revealed organized vandalism. Groups of men, likely connected to the Eternal Fire Church spreading from Novigrad, systematically destroying the old icons. The reasoning followed familiar patterns. When gods failed to prevent disaster, believers questioned. When questions went unanswered, faith curdled into resentment. The Eternal Fire priests offered an explanation. The old gods were false, impotent, unworthy. Their shrines deserved destruction. Only through submission to the proper divine authority could salvation arrive. That salvation never manifested proved irrelevant. The new faith offered structure, certainty, someone to burn. In Velen's chaos, even the promise of order, even brutal order, found traction. But Melitile's shrines, though vandalized, were not abandoned. The peasants replaced them, lit candles again, left offerings, because the eternal fire demanded submission, but offered no harvest blessings. And farmers require practical gods, deities with portfolio responsibilities that include making the grain grow. Then there were the other altars. The shrines in the deep bog bore different marks, where Melitile's altars stood by roads, accessible, communal. These lurked in shadow-thick woods where the trail narrowed to footpaths known only to locals. The icons depicted 3 figures, but the carving diverged from familiar forms. These faces, elongated, sharpened, suggested something between woman and predator. Weavings hung from branches. Ears, human ears, dried like jerky, dangled from twine nooses. The trail of treats. Parents led children down these paths, left them with pastries, honey cakes, preserved fruits arranged on stones. Some offerings the children ate, strengthening on sugar and fat when home cupboards stood bare. Other offerings the children became. The peasantry of Downwarren and surrounding settlements worshipped the ladies of the wood, also called the Crones of Crookback Bog, also called the Good Ladies, depending on who spoke and how recently they had pleased them. Bruis, Weavis, Wispes, names the locals assigned because the creatures' true names, if they possessed them, remained unknown. The Crones occupied a position beyond conventional divinity. They were not worshipped as distant powers, but acknowledged as present forces, entities that actively governed Velen through something between rule and predation. Their magic drew from earth and water, bound to the land itself, giving them awareness of everything that transpired within their domain. The ears served as surveillance network. Wispes demanded them, not metaphorically, not as symbol, actual physical ears, severed from supplicants who came seeking favor. The cutting was not sacrifice in the sense of offering something precious. It was tribute in the sense of extortion, payment extracted by threat. Give me this or receive nothing. Give me this or suffer worse. The crones hung the ears throughout the swamps, enchanted them to hear, and thus knew everything whispered in their woods. The elder men of Downwarren, when questioned, described the crones as harsh but just mistresses who demanded much. His people complied happily, his word choice, because the crones had cleansed the air of pestilence and provided seed when stores ran empty. The cost? Ears, children, occasional adult sacrifices when the crones required stronger magic. This was not worship as theology, but worship as transaction. The crones provided what the desperate needed. In return, they took what sustained them, and they took children. The orphanage in Crookback Bog operated under supervision of Gran, later revealed as Anna Strenger, the Bloody Baron's missing wife, bound to the crones through her own terrible bargain. The children lived there, seemingly protected, fed better than they would in any Velen village. They grew plump, happy, sang songs about their benefactors. The crones called them plump as piglets. This was not metaphor. The creatures required youth for their elixirs, the potions that maintained their power and preserved their immortal existence. Periodically, children disappeared from the orphanage. No bodies were discovered, no graves. The implication rested heavily in absence. The peasants knew. They knew and brought children anyway, because the alternative was watching those children starve slowly on farm floors, while the parents lacked even soiled flour to make gruel. The crones offered a possibility. Maybe the child would be spared, would live fat and safe for a season, a year, maybe forever. Unlikely, but possible. In Famine, possibility outweighed certainty of death. The game developers based the crones on multiple mythological sources: the Moirai of Greek tradition, the Parcae of Rome, the Weird Sisters from Shakespeare, Baba Yaga from Slavic folklore, and Polish Rodzenice, birth spirits who determine fate. This synthesis created entities that functioned as rulers, predators, and embodiment of Velen itself: ancient, cruel, occasionally beneficent, always hungry. Their legitimacy derived from results. When peasants prayed to Melitele and the harvest failed, Melitele offered no response. When peasants petitioned the crones and the next day seed appeared in their barns, the crones demonstrated power. Faith requires proof in desperate times. This was governance by terror and occasional mercy, and it worked because the alternative, Temeria's absent king, the Nilfgaardian occupiers demanding taxes on non-existent surplus, offered neither. Before the three, there was one. The book She Who Knows, found, scattered throughout Velen, recounts an origin story, but the book's perspective requires immediate suspicion. It presents a narrative favorable to the Crones' image as benevolent deities, the kind of history that serves the powerful. The victors write the chronicles. The survivors shape the myths. What follows is what the Crones wanted remembered. According to this account, the original Lady of the Wood, sometimes called the Mother, sometimes She Who Knows, came from a faraway land and ruled Velen before human memory. Lonely, she created 3 daughters from dirt and water, beings to serve as her voice and hands. For a time, this arrangement functioned. The lady received offerings, grain, animals, men. In return, she kept the balance that allowed settlement, prevented the wild from reclaiming everything. Then, the account claims, the lady fell into madness. As the years passed, the Lady of the Wood supposedly slipped deeper and deeper into this madness. Her madness spread over the land. Men took to abandoning their homes and setting out into the bog, where they became food for beasts. Before long, Velen was drowning in blood. The daughters saw their land nearing destruction and took it upon themselves to save it. When spring came once more, and with it the night of sacrifices, they killed their mother and buried her in the bog. Her blood watered the oak atop Ard Serban, and from then on the tree grew wholesome and hearty fruit for the people. As for the lady's immortal soul, it refused to leave its beloved land, and so the sisters imprisoned it beneath the whispering hillock, where it thrashes about in powerless rage. This is the story the Crones allow to circulate. Whether it contains truth or serves merely as justification for matricide, or something else entirely, remains unclear. The book itself, if read carefully, admits that the only account of this comes from locals who worship the Crones. Given the long amount of time that has passed since the Lady of the Wood walked the land, this information may not be entirely truthful. What is verifiable, beneath the whispering hillock, something ancient and furious remained trapped, and that something possessed a legitimate grievance. The locals avoided it. The tree that grew from the lady's burial spread malignant influence, luring travelers close, then killing them. Whether this was the imprisoned spirit's resentment or simple magical contamination remained disputed. What mattered? The place was dangerous. The Crones took their mother's place, if mother she truly was, and refined her methods. Instead of governing through mysterious balance, they governed through explicit transaction. Need protection from beasts? Offer a child. Need seed grain? Provide an ear. They made the cost clear, the benefits immediate. Peasants understood this better than they understood the old lady's ineffable ways. But the whisper under the hillock continued whispering, and sometimes the desperate listened. Famine introduces new currencies. When crowns lose value, because no merchant will sell what does not exist, because money cannot be eaten, other mediums emerge. In Velen, the currencies diversified. Flesh, obedience, portions of the self, children, hope, ears. The Crones operated what could be understood as a ritual economy. Not barter, which implies equivalence, but tributary relations where the powerful extract specific offerings in return for specific benefits. The tribute need not be proportional. The benefit need not be guaranteed. What matters is establishing the relationship, acknowledging the hierarchy, and maintaining the flow. Consider the ears again. They served multiple functions. Practically, they extended the Crones' awareness, enchanted into surveillance devices. Symbolically, they marked the tribute payer as someone who had submitted, literally carved obedience into their body. Economically, they cost the giver substantially. Disfigurement, pain, permanent loss, while costing the Crones nothing. The asymmetry was the point. A ritual economy thrives on calculated irrationality. From outside, cutting off ears to receive seed seems absurd. The seed has material value. The ear, once severed, provides no productive capacity. But this analysis ignores the demonstration of power. The Crones prove they can demand self-mutilation and receive it, which establishes a dominance that makes future demands easier to enforce. The children operated similarly. Their offering represented maximum sacrifice. Parents yielding their future, their lineage, their genetic legacy. The Crones consuming those offerings demonstrated not just power, but a specific kind of power, the ability to devour what a society values most and face no consequence. Yet the system included elements of reciprocity, warped though it was. When Downwarren faced plague, the Crones cleansed the air. When famine struck, they provided seed. These were not gifts, but calculated investments. Dead peasants offered no tribute. The Crones maintained the population at subsistence level, kept enough alive to supply their needs, eliminated surplus that might enable resistance. From their perspective, this was sustainable resource management. From the peasant's perspective, it was salvation, the quest. A greedy god illustrated a cruder version. A creature calling itself the All-God demanded extravagant offerings from starving villagers, fine wine, rich foods, delicacies impossible to obtain. The worshippers complied, leaving their best, which was never sufficient. Investigation revealed the All-God as a corpulent Sylvan, a minor supernatural entity, hiding in a cellar and gorging on tributes. The difference between the All-God and the Crones: one was parasite, the other infrastructure. The All-God gave nothing back. His demands escalated without providing benefit. He threatened plague but delivered no protection. He represented pure extraction. The Crones gave enough to perpetuate dependence. They cured diseases they perhaps caused. They provided seed that might have been grain taken from other villages. But they delivered, which was more than any king managed. In the calculus of famine, effectiveness trumped morality. The spirit trapped beneath the hillock offered different terms. When Geralt investigated per the Crones' request, he discovered an ancient consciousness imprisoned in earth, bound to an oak, furious at centuries of captivity. The spirit claimed innocence, or at least lesser guilt. It argued that the Crones lied, that the daughters usurped the mother through treachery, that Velen suffered under their rule when it might prosper under hers. The spirit spoke in a woman's voice and claimed to have once been a druidess who had kept watch over the Velen Grove until the Crones murdered her and imprisoned her ghost in the tree. This account contradicts the She Who Knows book's narrative, which presents the spirit as the Crones' mad mother, rather than an unrelated druidess. Two stories, two claims to victimhood. No way to know which held truth, if either did. Difficult to verify claims from angry ghosts. An unsettling detail. When Geralt looted the spirit's remains after killing it, he commented that the bones seemed strange, not human. This could imply that, like the Crones themselves, the spirit's original form was not truly human, lending some weight to the familial connection the book describes. But nothing conclusive emerged. The spirit's offer: release me, and I will save the children the Crones intend to devour. The bargain carried logic. The children would live. The Crones would lose their meal and their leverage. The spirit would gain freedom. The consequences, detailed through divergent game outcomes, revealed the nature of such bargains. Release the spirit. It saved the children, teleporting them to safety in Novigrad under the care of a woman called Marabella. But freed, the spirit attacked Downwarren. It possessed the villagers and made them turn on each other, leaving a massacre in its wake. This could suggest the Crones' account of their mother's destructive madness contained some truth, or simply that centuries of imprisonment had twisted whatever the spirit once was into something vengeful. The Crones then punished Anna, Gran, for losing the children, transforming her into a water hag. When the curse was lifted, she died, and the Bloody Baron committed suicide in grief. Killed the spirit, Downwarren survived. Anna lived, though shattered psychologically by her role in the children's doom. The Baron took her away, seeking treatment that likely would fail. The orphans vanished into the Crones' bellies, nourishment for creatures that would continue ruling Velen. The classic moral dilemma: save the few at cost to the many, or sacrifice the few to preserve stability. But the framing missed something crucial. Neither option actually fixed Velen. The children saved in one path simply relocated the problem. They became street orphans in Novigrad, where different predators waited. The village saved in the other path remained under the Crones' dominion, which meant future children would face the same fate. The hunger continued regardless. This was the trap. Personal intervention could alter individual outcomes but could not address systemic starvation. Geralt could save children or villagers, not both, and saving either accomplished nothing structural. The land remained depleted. The occupiers remained extractive. The ritual economy remained necessary because no alternative existed. Freeing the spirit introduced one more predatory entity into Velen's ecosystem. Killing it preserved the previous equilibrium. Neither choice generated food or rebuilt infrastructure or restored what the war destroyed. The developers understood this. The quest branching paths lead to different tragedies, not to solutions. Because solutions to famine require resources, time, peace, investment, none of which Velen possessed. What remained was triage, managing losses, choosing which horror to enable. And the Crones, for all their cruelty, provided management. Not all of Velen starved equally. Fyke Isle stood in Lake Windermere, isolated, home to a tower where Lord Viserad, the former Lord of Velen and previous owner of Crow's Perch, had relocated his court when Nilfgaardian armies approached. The Lord wallowed in excess while famine raged. His granaries remained full, his tables groaned with meat, his courtiers drank imported wine, while peasants on the mainland boiled leather for sustenance. What happened next became the subject of local legend, though the truth proved more complex than the tales suggested. According to local telling, the gods saw fit to punish him. One day, mice swarmed the tower and proceeded to devour everything, including Viserad, his court, and his resident mage, Alexander. The tale carried folk justice satisfaction. The greedy lord consumed by vermin, literally eaten by what he hoarded. But investigation revealed a messier reality. Alexander, the court sorcerer, had been conducting experiments on the tower's mice, research into epidemiology and the Catriona plague. The rodents that eventually overran the tower were not divine punishment, but the consequence of magical tampering gone wrong, and the peasants played their own role. Enraged by the lord's indifference to their suffering, some villagers stormed the tower seeking to kill those responsible for their misery. The chaos of that assault, combined with Alexander's experimental subjects, created the catastrophe. The lord's daughter, Annabelle, survived the initial attack by drinking a potion Alexander provided, one that put her in a corpse-like state of paralysis. She believed it would protect her until the violence ended. Instead, she woke unable to move as the rats consumed her while she still lived. Her spirit became a pesta, a plague maiden, haunting the tower and spreading disease to any who approached. The isle became cursed, haunted, avoided by fishermen whose livelihood suffered accordingly. The Fyke Isle tragedy illustrated the structure beneath Velen's suffering. Viserad possessed resources. He could have distributed food, reinforced his position through generosity, built loyalty that might protect him when protection mattered. Instead, he isolated, hoarded, consumed his surplus while surrounded by starvation. The consequences, whether framed as divine judgment or mundane causality, followed inevitably. The curse that followed represented secondary effects of the same hoarding impulse. Viserad removed resources from circulation. His death removed nothing because he had already removed himself through isolation. The cursed tower simply formalized absence that already existed. This pattern repeated throughout Velen's aristocracy. Martin Föhl fled to Kovir. Other lords abandoned estates. The Baron, Philip Strenger, held Crow's Perch through force, extracting what he needed from surroundings already stripped, maintaining power without legitimacy or purpose beyond maintaining power. The nobility's evacuation left a vacuum. In functional states, aristocrats manage resources, coordinate response to crisis, distribute reserves during shortage. The system operates through mutual obligation. Lords protect, peasants produce. Each party fulfills their role. When lords flee, the system collapses, and peasants face crisis without institutional support. Into that vacuum, other powers emerged. The Crones filled administrative absence. Where no lord governed, they governed. Where no one coordinated distribution, they became distributors. Their rule was monstrous, but it was rule, which was more than could be said for Temeria or Redania or Nilfgaard, or any of the kingdoms whose soldiers created the crisis. Disease requires different analysis. The epidemic that struck post-invasion was not random misfortune, but predictable outcome. War creates epidemiological perfect storms, population displacement, breakdown of sanitation, contaminated water, corpse disposal failure, malnutrition, weakening immune response, vector proliferation. Add occupation, where conquerors neither know nor care about local disease patterns, and you guarantee outbreak. The quest Hazardous Goods demonstrated the spread mechanism. Nilfgaardian soldiers, rotating through Velen, carried infection. Local healers lacked resources for treatment. The afflicted were quarantined too late or not at all. The disease radiated from initial vectors through predictable transmission routes, caregivers, family members, anyone handling contaminated materials. In some senses, plague was more egalitarian than famine. It killed rich and poor, young and old, Nilfgaardian and Temerian. But its impact concentrated on the already vulnerable. Well-fed populations resist infection better. Those with resources evacuate. Those with power quarantine effectively. Those without any of these die first and fastest. The plague also created new economic dynamics. Healers commanded desperate prices. Quarantine enforcers wielded arbitrary authority. Corpse handlers, necessary but contaminated, occupied a social position between essential and untouchable. The disease spawned its own service economy, and in Velen's depleted context, these services consumed resources that might otherwise go to food. More insidiously, the plague damaged future productive capacity. Survivors of serious illness often suffer lingering effects, reduced strength, compromised cognition, chronic pain. A population that survives plague inherits a workforce operating below baseline, which means lower output, which means continued scarcity, which means vulnerability to next season's threats. The cycle, again, feeding itself. The Crones claim to cleanse the air. Whether they actually possess plague control capabilities or simply performed ritual while natural disease cycles ran their course remained ambiguous. But in the absence of public health infrastructure, even performative intervention provided psychological benefit. People who believe they are protected sometimes survive through stress reduction, improved morale, continuation of productive activity instead of despair-induced paralysis, and if the Crones occasionally cause the plagues they claim to cure, introducing disease strategically to increase dependence, well, that would be consistent with their governance model. Create the need, fulfill the need, extract payment. Repeat. No evidence confirms this, but absence of evidence means little when dealing with creatures that hear through severed ears and eat children for longevity. One more factor complicated Velen's already impossible economics. The swamps and forests harbored predators, drowners in the wetlands, leshens in the deep forest, wraiths where violence soaked the earth, neckers emerging from burrows, ghouls feasting at battlefields. These were not metaphorical monsters, but physical threats that killed regularly. In stable times, this represented manageable risk. Villages maintained walls, patrols, warning systems. But war destroyed defensive infrastructure. Able-bodied fighters died in battles or marched away with armies. The remaining population, elderly, infirm, children, could not defend against monster attacks. This imposed additional costs. Farmers could not work fields after dusk because drowners lurked near water sources, and evening was when monsters hunted. This reduced productive hours. Shepherds lost livestock to predators, shrinking protein availability. Travelers were killed on roads, collapsing trade further. Each monster death represented not just individual tragedy, but economic loss. A laborer gone, a craftsman devoured, accumulated skills erased. Hiring a witcher provided one solution, but witchers charged rates peasants could not afford. The contract system worked in normal economies where someone, lord, merchant guild, wealthy property owner, could pay professional rates for a monster elimination. In Velen, where currency hardly circulated, hiring witchers became impossible for most. Some villages scraped together payment through collective effort. Contract, swamp thing. Recorded such cases, pooled resources, promissory, arrangements, negotiations over payment in kind. But this required coordination, trust that the witcher would actually deliver, belief that the benefit exceeded the cost. For many villages, the simpler solution was abandonment. Let the monsters have the field. Avoid the road. Live smaller. Accept losses. This reduced the habitable area of Velen, concentrating population into fewer defended spaces, which created overcrowding, which exacerbated disease transmission, which increased death rates, which reduced labor pool, which shrunk productivity, which deepened scarcity. The monsters thus functioned as environmental pressure, not unlike drought or frost, natural hazard that shaped human possibility. But unlike drought, monsters were intentional. They hunted, they selected victims, they learned where to find prey, and they multiplied when food was abundant. The battlefields after major engagements drew necrophages, ghouls, grave hags, anything that fed on corpses. These creatures gorged, bred, established territories. When the battlefields were picked clean, they radiated outward, seeking new sources of carrion. Villages provided that. So did refugees. So did anyone too weak to flee. The Crones permitted certain monster populations, eliminated others. The creatures in the swamps served as additional barrier, keeping supplicants on designated paths, ensuring that only the determined reached the inner bog. The Crones curated their environment, maintained an ecosystem that supported their rule. Elsewhere in Velen, monsters simply filled the spaces humans vacated. The province was reverting, slowly, to a state predating human settlement, when the wild creatures held domain, and the few humans who survived did so through submission or flight. While the Crones consolidated power in the bogs, another force moved through Velen's villages. The Eternal Fire Church, spreading from Novigrad, sent missionaries and witch hunters into the war-torn countryside. Their message carried simplicity's appeal: abandon the false gods who permitted this suffering, submit to the one true faith, and salvation would follow. Those who refused faced accusations of heresy, which in practice meant execution. The witch hunters destroyed nobility shrines. They burned accused practitioners of traditional magic. They established dominance through public displays of righteous violence, demonstrating that their god was stronger because they were more willing to kill for him. This was not theology, but conquest. The Eternal Fire faith established itself through elimination of alternatives, conversion by force, and promise of otherworldly reward for present submission. It offered no food, no healing, no practical benefit, but it offered certainty in an uncertain time. And certainty, even if certainly doomed, provided psychological comfort. The faithful could believe their suffering had meaning, that they endured testing before eventual reward, that their children's deaths were part of divine plan rather than random cruelty of economics and war. This was not nothing. In conditions where material improvement was impossible, spiritual explanation became the remaining consolation. But the Eternal Fire demanded more than nobility. Where the old goddess accepted what worshippers could spare, the new faith required everything: total obedience, renunciation of previous practices, identification and punishment of backsliders. The religion came with surveillance, hierarchy, enforcement mechanisms. In some villages, the Fire Church established itself as alternative authority structure, parallel to or superseding secular power. Priest judgments carried weight. Accusations of heresy could destroy families. Piety became currency. Performing devotion generated social capital, while skepticism marked one for suspicion. This created new fissures in already fractured communities: believer versus heretic, true faith versus false, righteous versus damned. These divisions consumed energy that might otherwise address practical problems, but they also provided outlet for rage and grief that had nowhere else to go. When you cannot fight the occupiers or reverse the famine, you can at least burn the witch. The Eternal Fire found purchase in Velen because it offered what the circumstances demanded: enemy to hate, action to take, explanation for suffering, community of the righteous. That none of this alleviated actual conditions was, in the moment, less relevant than the feeling of doing something, of serving purpose. And the church provided structure, hierarchy, clearly delineated authority. In chaotic times, even oppressive structure beats formless dread. Meanwhile, the actually hungry found creative solutions. The peasants ate what remained: bark, grass, things that filled the stomach without nourishing. That gave the sensation of eating while the body continued consuming itself. Technically, humans can survive on surprisingly marginal diets. The body is resilient, capable of extracting nutrition from inadequate sources. But this survival comes at cost: stunted growth in children, cognitive impairment, vulnerability to any additional stress. A population eating bark can function at a subsistence level until anything goes wrong: a cold winter, a bad spring, a wound that needs healing. Then they die, not from the immediate crisis, but from having no reserves. Velen's population was living on reserves that had already been depleted. The Trail of Treats made horrible sense in this context. The honey cakes and preserved fruits left as offerings represented extraordinary luxury. Foods requiring refined flour, sweetener, preservation techniques that had become memory in most households. Yet someone made them. Someone expended resources creating these offerings while their own children went hungry, because the crones repaid in seed grain, which was investment. A honey cake today bought survival next season. The calculation was brutal but correct. Sacrifice now to persist. The alternative was consuming everything immediately and facing starvation with nothing held back. This distinguished famine from mere hunger. Hunger is temporary, fixable by the next meal. Famine is structural, extending through time, requiring decisions that sacrifice present for future or vice versa. Whether we included the children offered along with the cakes remained an ugly question with an uglier answer. Geralt of Rivia moved through Velen seeking information about Ciri, his adopted daughter. His quest put him adjacent to the famine without forcing direct engagement. He could help the orphans or not, confront the crones or serve them, choose sides in disputes or pass by. This freedom marked him as outsider. For Velen's inhabitants, there were no choices, only endurance. They could not leave because they lacked resources to relocate. They could not fight because they lacked strength to resist. They could not abstain from the ritual economy because abstention meant death. Geralt's ability to walk away, to treat situations as quests with multiple solutions, revealed the chasm between those who exist in a system and those who pass through it. His contracts demonstrated this asymmetry. Villagers pooled scarce resources to pay witcher rates calibrated to normal economic conditions, not famine. From Geralt's perspective, the payment was barely adequate. From the villagers' perspective, it represented everything they had. This was not exploitation, precisely. Geralt delivered what he promised: dead monsters, lifted curses, problem solved. But the underlying assumption that his labor deserved specific compensation, that he could refuse if payment was insufficient, operated within an economy that Velen had exited. Money meant something to him. To the villagers, only survival meant something. The game mechanics encoded this tension. Players accumulated wealth through looting, contracts, selling monster parts. Velen overflowed with treasure in the form of abandoned caches, bandit camps, supplies left by the dead. From a gameplay perspective, this rewarded exploration. From a lore perspective, it meant profiting from disaster, extracting value from a region that had nothing to spare. This was perhaps unfair criticism. Geralt cleaned out bandit camps, which removed threats. He killed monsters, which protected villages. His presence generated positive externalities, even when he worked for selfish reasons. But it remained true that he left Velen wealthier than he arrived, while the province grew continually poor. The Witcher economy ran parallel to the famine economy without intersecting. He operated in a different medium, dealing in coins and contracts, while the villagers operated in tribute and survival. Both existed in the same physical space, but might as well have inhabited separate worlds. Philip Strenger, called the Bloody Baron, held Crow's Perch through military force. He commanded a garrison, collected taxes from those who had anything to pay, and maintained order in the immediate vicinity. This made him something between warlord and legitimate authority, filling the vacuum left by Temeria's collapse. His rule was brutal because brutality was the only force that functioned. Kindness required surplus. Mercy required security. Negotiation required mutual leverage. Velen offered none of these. What it offered was violence, and those who commanded violence commanded everything else. The Baron's story intertwined with the ritual economy through his wife, Anna. Her bargain with the Crones illuminated the desperation that drove people to such terms. Anna had been pregnant but did not wish to bear another child with the husband she had come to hate, a man whose drinking and violence had driven her to plan escape. She turned to the Crones, hoping they would terminate the pregnancy. The Crones agreed they would end her pregnancy in exchange for a year of service. But the Crones' bargains were ever deceitful. They granted her wish in their own twisted way, with a curse that made the fetus wither, but that also slowly drained Anna's own life energy. She was dying along with the child she'd not wanted. In despair, Anna sought help from the local peller, who made her a talisman to hamper the evil magic's influence. This bought her time. But during a violent confrontation with her drunken husband on the night she and her daughter Tamara attempted to flee, she lost the talisman. Without its protection, the curse reasserted itself. A fiend, a beast controlled by the Crones, dragged her to the heart of Crookback Bog, where she paid back her debt as their slave. By the time Geralt found her, she had become Gran, the woman who cared for the orphanage children. Her mind had fractured under the weight of what she had done and witnessed. She fed children to monsters and no longer remembered why this was wrong. Anna's fate demonstrated the Crones' methodology. She remained useful until she failed, losing the orphans through Geralt's intervention or the spirit's release. Then she became punishment object, transformed into a water hag as message. Defy us, and this is your reward. Whether she survived or died depended on player choices that affected the Whispering Hillock. But survival meant living with destroyed mind, broken by guilt and transformation and memory of the children she fed to monsters. Death might have been mercy. The Baron's suicide, in the path where Anna died, represented recognition that some losses cannot be endured. He had power but no family, authority but no legitimacy, a fortress but no home. The war had taken everything except his ability to inflict violence, and that was not enough to continue. His story paralleled Velen itself, still standing, still functioning after a fashion, but hollowed out, animated by momentum rather than vitality, waiting for something to provide either salvation or final blow. One detail haunted the economic collapse more than the rest. The fields of Velen were not burned. The soil was not salted. The infrastructure of agriculture, terracing, irrigation ditches, windmills, barns, largely survived. What failed was not capacity but will, not ability but population, not land but people. This made recovery theoretically possible. Given seed, labor, and time, the fields could produce again. The harvest could return. Velen could feed itself. But theory requires inputs that did not exist. Seed required someone to have saved it instead of eating it. Labor required living workers instead of plague corpses. Time required absence of roaming armies, occupying forces, and monster attacks. None of these conditions obtained. The possibility of recovery, tantalizingly visible in the unburned fields, made the actual continuation of famine more cruel. The land could give. The land was willing. The land lay ready for the plow. But the plows rusted because the oxen were slaughtered, the farmers were dead, and the seed was in bellies instead of ground. This was the special torment of man-made disasters. They were reversible, preventable, fixable through application of resources that existed somewhere but not here. Natural famines, drought, blight, locust, offered no such hope. The land failed. Nothing could be done. Acceptance came easier. Here the land waited. The rain fell, the seasons turned. Everything necessary for abundance existed except the human element, which had been destroyed not by divine curse or natural catastrophe, but by decisions made by kings and generals who would never miss a meal. The orphans who ate their dog understood this, though they could not articulate it. The food was here. The food was always here. It was in granaries guarded by soldiers. It was in lords' pantries behind locked doors. It was in merchant wagons moving north to better markets. The food existed. They simply had no access to it. Starvation in the presence of plenty is its own category of suffering, distinct from absolute scarcity. It means dying while knowing you could have lived. If only the distribution were different. If only the priorities were different. If only someone with power decided your life mattered. The Crones understood this. Their power derived from being the only ones willing to redistribute, on their terms, for their prices, but they distributed. They brought seed when no one else would. They took children when no one else could feed them. They filled the function that every legitimate government exists to serve, managing resources so the population survives. That they did it monstrously did not change that they did it, which was more than could be said for Temeria or Redania or Nilfgaard or any of the kingdoms whose soldiers created the crisis. Return now to the equations with which this chronicle opened. Velen's famine was not event, but condition. It predated the war. The province was poor before and would persist after peace, if peace ever came. The land was marginal, the resources limited, the population vulnerable. These were constants. War added variables: destruction, displacement, disease, occupation, the severing of trade routes. These variables transformed chronic poverty into acute crisis, but removing them would not restore prosperity. It would only return Velen to its previous baseline of manageable deprivation. The Crones represented an adaptation to this reality. They were not solution but system, not rescue but ritual, not salvation but survival mechanism. They arose from Velen's conditions and were sustained by those conditions and would continue until the conditions changed or something stronger replaced them. The famine, in this light, was less economic problem than expression of political order. Food scarcity was symptom, not cause. The cause was system failure at every level. Kingdoms that could not protect, armies that could not refrain from plundering, lords who fled instead of leading, faiths that offered afterlife instead of bread. Into that systemic void, the Crones stepped. They governed because no one else would. They extracted because extraction was governance. They killed because killing maintained the minimum viable population. They fed enough people to perpetuate the cycle. This was horrible. This was also functional. And functionality, in Velen's circumstances, was the highest achievement available. The question that haunted the region was not, how do we end the famine? Because the answer required resources no one possessed. The question was, how do we survive until conditions change? And the answer was, through ritual, through sacrifice, through tribute to the powers that actually held power. Whether those powers were 3 ancient creatures in a bog or the distant monarchs issuing proclamations from safe capitals, hardly mattered. Both demanded sacrifice, both took children, one through tribute, one through conscription. Both promised protection they could not deliver. The Crones at least were honest about the transaction. Velen, then, a province emptied but not abandoned, fields waiting for farmers who would not come, roads lined with gibbets where deserters hung until the crows picked clean, shrines to silent gods and worse gods who answered, children singing songs about generous ladies while waiting their turn to be devoured, a barren ruling ruins, a plague with no cure, a hunger with no end. The game preserved this as interactive space, location where players fought monsters and completed quests and looted treasure, but beneath the mechanics ran the chronicle of a place that had failed, not through any single catastrophe, but through accumulation, through the grinding mathematics of war, plus famine, plus occupation, plus disease. The developers, building from Polish history, the experiences of villages in the Carpathian Mountains, the familiarity with rural poverty, the national memory of occupation and resistance, encoded truth into the swampland. They understood that suffering need not be dramatic to be total. That absence speaks louder than spectacle, that the real horror is not the monster in the mist, but the quiet recognition that tomorrow will be like today and the day after that. And the only variation is which child we send to the bog. Velen was not allegory. It was memorial for places that existed and still exist, where famine walks as infrastructure, where the powerful demand tribute, where the vulnerable trade pieces of themselves for possibility of survival, for the economies that run on desperation, the gods that feed on suffering, the rulers who govern through managed scarcity. The swamps hold their breath because breathing implies hope, and hope requires the belief that change is possible. Velen offered no such belief. It offered only continuation, the eternal return of harvest that fails, and winter that comes, and spring that brings nothing but the renewal of need. In this landscape, the Crones were not aberration. They were perfection of the system, its purest expression, its final honest form. They took what they took and gave what they gave and made no apology and required no justification. They simply were, as the hunger simply was, as Velen itself simply was, a place where the arithmetic of nothing balanced perfectly, where every subtraction found its equation, where the desperate counted costs in ears and children and discovered the price was always the price and would always be paid. The game allowed players to leave, to fast travel away, to forget Velen once its quests were completed. Its inhabitants had no such option. They remained in the swamps, beside the altars, walking the trail of treats, waiting for the next demand, the next winter, the next war. They remained because there was nowhere else, because this was all there was, because even no man's land is a land, and must be lived in by someone. The bogs whisper with their continuation. The Crones listen through severed ears. The hunger waits, patient as the soil, certain as the seasons, quiet as the grave, For those who seek more chronicles from the continent's shadowed corners, similar explorations await. The archive grows, the histories deepen, the old places remember themselves through telling. Until then, the swamps breathe their held note, and Velen endures. If this chronicle has illuminated something of the continent's darker corners, consider subscribing for future explorations. Your support allows these histories to continue.